For all of recorded history, Siberia in the far east of Russia has been known for its extreme terrain and harsh climates, which have made the people and their culture unique. As reindeer herders, hunters, and fishermen, Siberian nomadic tribes have defied the elements for centuries and continue to do so today. The environment of a people often influences their traditions, beliefs, and spirituality, with gods and goddesses reflecting the natural surroundings. Long before the communists, czars, or Mongols, ancient Siberian peoples worshipped animistic spirits, guided by shamans, elders, and priests. The indigenous shamanistic traditions in Siberian regions like Buryatia and Tuva were later influenced by the spread of Buddhism from Mongolia and Tibet. This blend of local traditions with Tibetan Buddhist teachings formed one of the most fascinating and historically persecuted sects of Buddhism in the world. You may be wondering, though, how did Buddhism, a religion originating in India, find its way into the remote regions of Siberia? Buddhism is believed to have been founded in Nepal by the Shakyamuni Buddha in the 5th or 6th century BC, where after his enlightenment, he taught the Buddhist Dharma, or teachings, in India. After his death, Buddha's disciples spread these teachings across India, Southeast Asia, and even into West Asia along the Silk Road. Eventually, in the 8th century AD, a tantric Indian guru named Padmasambhava introduced Buddhism to Tibet. Riding a mythical flying tigress, he subdued the gods and goddesses of Tibet, commanding them to protect the Buddhist Dharma. This led to the union of Buddhism with indigenous Tibetan beliefs and myths. Tibetan Buddhism would make its way into many surrounding regions in the coming centuries, including northward into Siberia. The Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the order practiced in Siberia, is also the seat of the Dalai Lamas. Upon winning the allegiance of Altan Khan in 1578, a Gelugpa hierarch named Sonam Gyatso was bestowed the Mongolian title Ocean of Wisdom, or Dalai Lama, by the Khan. Under the 5th Dalai Lama, Ngawang Gyatso, many Mongolian Khans began to submit to Tibetan spiritual and political authority by the early 17th century. This included Galdan Boshuktu Khan of the Dzungar Khanate, extending this influence to the people of Buryatia and Tuva on the borders of his land. Despite the war between the Dzungar Mongols and the Qing dynasty, Buddhist missionaries from Tibet continued to support the patrons of Buryatia and Tuva amidst the fighting. In the 18th century, under the reign of Khelzang Gyatso, the 7th Dalai Lama, lamas were even sent to the Mongolian regions, including Buryatia and Tuva, to encourage the building of new monasteries. Many Buryats and Tuvans adopted Buddhism into their cultural identity at this time, while maintaining their traditional beliefs and practices. Though Buddhism is a relatively recent arrival in Siberia, it quickly took root and spread throughout the region. By the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, Buryatia alone was home to 46 Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. As Buddhism spread, Russia continued to expand eastward after conquering the Siberian Khanate in 1582. Russian colonizers established trade and diplomatic relations with the indigenous people, while Orthodox missionaries worked to convert them. By the time Russian settlers arrived in Buryatia and Tuva, Buddhism had already become the dominant faith among local clans. Though initially non-violent, Russian efforts to convert the Buryats and Tuvans eventually became more forceful through military pressure and diplomacy. The Treaty of Nerchinsk, signed in 1689 between Russia and the Qing dynasty, officially recognized Buryatia as part of Russia. By 1727, Russia had firmly established administrative control. Despite this, Buryats maintained their devotion to Buddhism, which had been steadily integrated into their culture over centuries. In contrast, Tuva maintained its political autonomy much longer due to its strong ties to Mongolian Khanates and Tibetan religious leaders. The Russian diplomats' attempts at trade and conversion in the 17th century were largely resisted by the Tuvans, who were suspicious of Russia's influence. While Tuva's political landscape was shaped by the Khalkha Mongols during the 17th and 18th centuries, the 1689 Treaty of Nerchinsk placed Tuva under Qing sovereignty. The Qing, however, imposed less control over Tuva, allowing local Khans to continue governing in a traditional manner. In 1911, with the fall of the Qing dynasty, Tuva declared independence from China. A decade later, in 1921, it declared itself the Tuvan People's Republic with initial support from the Soviet Union. However, in 1944, the USSR annexed Tuva, ending its long struggle for independence, ushering in an era of religious persecution. The Soviets aimed to create a society free from religion, leading to the suppression of faiths across the country, including Buddhism in Buryatia and later Tuva. Initially, they framed their actions as a liberation of the Tuvans and Buryats from Tsarist repression, using persuasive tactics to win over the Buddhist communities. However, their propaganda efforts were largely unsuccessful. Starting in the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviets began repressing the spiritual practices of Siberian Buddhists. The 1920s saw the closure of monasteries and datsans. In 1931, high-ranking Buddhist clergy were persecuted, and by 1935, all Buddhist clergy, both high and middle-ranking, were imprisoned. Despite this, the Buryats and Tuvans maintained their Buddhist identity, as evidenced by significant populations still identifying as Buddhist in the 1937 census. By the end of World War II, nearly all monasteries, except the Ivolginsky Datsan, were closed or destroyed, often by the League of Militant Atheists. Many Buddhist clergy were executed or sent to labor camps, and Stalin's regime intensified persecution, targeting both lamas and lay people. In addition to religious suppression, the Soviets imposed Russian language and culture, restricting local customs. Despite the ban, many continued to practice Buddhism underground, preserving their traditions. Monasteries were purged, and sacred texts were confiscated and sent to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Tibetan texts were smuggled into the region, but the younger generation began to lose touch with traditional practices, even after the repression eased following Stalin's death. Many Buddhist relics and texts were lost during this time, with most confiscated items remaining in Russian state museums or libraries even after the Soviet Union collapsed. While some manuscripts have been returned to the Buddhist community, the full restitution of these materials remains incomplete. With the fall of the Soviet Union, religious freedom in Siberia increased significantly. Relations with Tibet were re-established, highlighted by the Dalai Lama's 1991 visit to Buryatia, Kalmykia, and Oginsky. New monasteries were built, and Tibetan festivals such as Losar, New Year, and Saga Dawa, Buddha's birth, were reinstated. The 1990s also saw the restoration of old monasteries like the famous Ivolginsky Datsan and the resurgence of the Khambo Lama, the spiritual leader of Buryatia. Buddhism in Siberia is more than just a religion. It is a profound aspect of the region's identity. From its early introduction through Tibetan influence to the harsh suppression under Soviet rule, Buddhism has survived and even flourished in the face of adversity. It has blended with the region's indigenous traditions, creating a unique form of spiritual practice that reflects both resilience and adaptation.